Colonel Potter, sir. My last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Alda became the face of one of the most successful television shows ever created, but that's not the part people question. What's harder to explain is what was happening around him at the same time. Because while the show was growing, becoming more successful, more influential, more respected, something else was happening in the background that didn't match that success at all. Key actors were leaving, sometimes suddenly, sometimes without explanation, and in some cases, without even a proper goodbye. And that's where things stop making sense, because if everything was working, why were so many people walking away? What makes this even more unusual is that none of these exits looked connected at first. Each one had its own reason, its own timing, its own explanation. But when you step back and look at them together, a pattern begins to form. And this is the part most people didn't notice, because those patterns weren't obvious while the show was running. They only become clear when you trace everything back, step by step, from the very beginning. And once you see it, it becomes difficult to ignore. To understand how this started, you have to go back before the show itself, before television, before the success. The idea didn't begin on screen. It began with a novel written from real experience, shaped by someone who had actually lived through the environment it was describing. That foundation gave the story something different, something that felt grounded, even when it was humorous. And when it was adapted into a film, that tone carried forward, mixing satire with something much heavier underneath. By the time it became a television series, the format changed again. It became more character-driven, more layered, more flexible in how it told its stories. But here's what most people don't realize: it didn't succeed immediately. The first season struggled. Ratings were low, and cancellation was a real possibility. It wasn't until a shift in scheduling and audience exposure that things began to change. And once they did, the show didn't just recover, it transformed into something much bigger than expected. But here's where the shift begins, because as the show evolved, its structure changed with it. What started as an ensemble slowly began to center around one figure, and while that helped define its identity, it also created imbalance. Some characters expanded, others didn't. Some actors gained influence, others began to feel reduced. And this is where the first major fracture appears, not on screen, but behind it. McLean Stevenson was one of the earliest examples of this shift. His role was essential in the beginning, bringing warmth, humor, and a sense of humanity that balanced everything else. Audiences connected with him, critics recognized him, and his presence helped shape the show's early identity. But as the show moved forward, his position within it began to change. And this is where things become important, because it wasn't just about screen time. It was about direction. The focus was shifting, and he could feel it. His character was no longer central to the story in the same way, and over time, that difference became impossible to ignore. He had ambitions beyond the role, a desire to lead rather than support, and eventually, that led to a decision. He chose to leave. Now here's where things take a turn, because the show didn't handle his departure the way most shows would. There was no quiet exit, no simple explanation. Instead, they made a decision that changed television history. His character didn't leave. His character was killed. And that moment, delivered without warning, without build-up, without emotional preparation, created something audiences weren't used to. Silence. Shock. A realization that this wasn't just a comedy, it was something else entirely. And that decision worked, but it also revealed something deeper about the show itself. Wayne Rogers' departure told a different story, and in some ways, an even more revealing one. Because unlike Stevenson, he didn't get an ending. One episode he was there, the next, he wasn't. No goodbye, no explanation, no closure. And that raises a question: why would someone leave like that, especially at a time when the show was becoming more successful? To understand it, you have to look at the structure of the show during its early evolution. His character was originally positioned as a co-lead, part of a duo that defined the show's identity. The balance worked, audiences responded to it, and it created a dynamic that felt complete. But that balance didn't last. As the show developed, the focus shifted more heavily toward one central character, and while that strengthened the narrative, it reduced the role of others. And over time, that change became impossible to ignore. His character stopped evolving, stopped growing, stopped maturing in the same way. And this is where the decision was made. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly. He simply walked away. And here's where things become even more unusual: the structure of his contract allowed it. There was no restriction, no legal barrier, nothing forcing him to stay. So when he chose to leave, there was nothing stopping him. The result was confusion, both inside the production and among the audience. The show had to adjust quickly, replacing a central figure without explanation. And while it survived, the shift changed its dynamic permanently. If you're starting to see how these patterns connect, how individual decisions begin forming a larger structure, then you're already seeing what most people missed. And that's exactly why this matters, because these weren't random exits. They were signals. And if you want to understand how those signals continue shaping everything that comes next, subscribe to the channel, because what follows explains why this kept happening. Gary Burghoff's departure introduced something different, something that wasn't about ambition or creative control, but about pressure. On screen, his role represented stability, innocence, emotional grounding. He wasn't the loudest presence, but he was one of the most important. And that made his role unique. But behind the scenes, the reality was different. The schedule, the expectations, the emotional weight of the role, all of it began to build. And this is something most people don't consider, because long-running success comes with a cost. Consistency. And maintaining that consistency over years, under pressure, isn't easy. For him, it became unsustainable. And this is where the decision shifted from creative to personal. He needed to leave. But unlike previous exits, this one was handled with care. A proper farewell, a structured ending, a moment that allowed closure. And that difference matters, because it shows how the show itself had evolved. Larry Linville's exit reflects another kind of change, one driven by the direction of the show itself. His character had a clear role in the beginning, one that worked within the original tone. But as the show moved toward more complexity, more realism, that role became harder to maintain. And this is where awareness comes in. He recognized that his character had reached its limit, that it no longer fit the direction the show was moving toward. And instead of forcing it, he chose to step away. That decision didn't just affect him, it affected the show. Because it opened space for something new. David Ogden Stiers represents that shift. Not a replacement, but an evolution. A character that matched the tone the show had grown into, more layered, more complex, more aligned with its identity. And unlike others, he stayed until the end. Which reveals something important: not all departures come from conflict. Some come from completion. And then there's another layer most people overlook entirely: the consistency of certain characters, especially those who didn't leave. Because while many exits shaped the show, the stability of others defined it. And that balance, between change and consistency, is what allowed the show to evolve without collapsing. When you look at all of this together, the exits, the changes, the shifts in structure, a clear pattern appears. This wasn't just a successful show. It was a system under constant adjustment. And not everyone adjusted in the same way. Some adapted. Some left. And some stayed long enough to see it all the way through. Because in the end, the success of something like this isn't just about what works. It's about what had to change to make it work. And once you understand that, you start seeing these stories very differently. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand what's really happening behind situations like this.